Today, I have the privilege of visiting with you about monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance. I have no relevant disclosures. And our story begins a little over 50 years ago when I saw a 68-year-old woman who presented with low back pain, a significant reduction in hemoglobin, a gamma spike in her serum of 39 grams per liter, compression fractures, and lytic bone lesions, and a bone marrow containing 23% plasma cells. The diagnosis of multiple myeloma was made, and she was treated with radiation therapy for her back pain and given cyclophosphamide. And unfortunately, at this time in multiple myeloma, her survival was less than 1 year. Now, we have all of a patient's record available to us, and I noted that this particular patient had been to the Mayo Clinic as a 49-year-old woman in April of 1945, complaining of fatigue. Her hemoglobin, however, was respectable, and her sedimentation rate, however, was elevated at 118 millimeters per hour. The physician did a AG ratio, albumin, globulin, and found that the globulin was significantly elevated at 43 grams per liter. Now, why in the world didn't he order a serum protein electrophoresis, which every one of you would have done under these circumstances? However, at this time, serum protein electrophoresis was done with the Tiselius U-tube, which you see pictured here, and it took one technician 1 day to examine the serum of one patient. Not very practical. And furthermore, the cost of this instrument was approximately $5,000, which was a lot of money in the mid-1940s. However, the physician, the hematologist, did x-rays of the bones and found nothing, and then did a bone marrow examination, and that contained 3.6% plasma cells. And fortunately, he decided not to treat the patient. The patient returned home and came back to the Mayo Clinic 13 years later in May 1958 and was doing very well. Her hemoglobin was at the same level as it had been before. Sedimentation rate was still elevated in the same range at 120 millimeters per hour, and the bone marrow still contained fewer than 5% plasma cells. And again, he advised no therapy. And then this patient, as you saw in the first slide, returned when she had developed symptomatic multiple myeloma. Now, we published this case report, which is not very common these days. Editors do not accept many case reports. And I would also point out that Jan Waldenstrom in the mid-1950s recognized that some patients who had a myeloma peak in their serum protein electrophoretic pattern did not have multiple myeloma or any other disease. And so he promoted the term benign monoclonal gammopathy, and he felt that if the patient's M protein was stable for 3 years and had no clinical symptoms, that this patient had a benign monoclonal gammopathy. We mentioned in our case report that it was not safe to assume that these patients have a benign condition even after years of observation. And so I reviewed the electrophoretic patterns that we had done at the Mayo Clinic and selected those patients who had a spike but had no evidence of multiple myeloma, Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, amyloidosis, or lymphoma from 1956 until 1970. And then allowed for additional follow-up and published this paper in 1978. And we found that 64 of these 241 patients, approximately 25%, went on to develop a serious disease. 2/3 of them, 44% of the patients developed multiple myeloma. However, the median duration from the time of recognition of the M protein until the development of symptomatic myeloma was a median of over 10 years, with a range of 1 to 32 years. This particular patient who developed symptomatic myeloma in her 32nd year of follow-up had been well and stable, and then just 3 or 4 months after I had seen her, she called and said that she had back pain, and to make a long story short, she had obvious multiple myeloma. There were 7 patients in this group who developed Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, again, a median duration of 10 years after recognition of the M protein. 12% of the patients developed AL amyloidosis, median of 9 years, and 5 patients developed a lymphoma. Overall, 64 of these patients at a median of 10.4 years developed a serious plasma cell disorder. Here is the rate of increase, 17% at 10 years, 34% at 20 years, and 39% at 25 years. As many of you will note, these numbers are high, but serum protein electrophoresis at this time was done with filter paper as the supporting media for the most part, and the M spike was relatively large, 17 grams per liter. And so, ultimately, the definition of monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance, MGUS or MUGUS, was defined as having a serum M protein less than 30 grams per liter, a bone marrow containing less than 10% plasma cells if a marrow was done, and no evidence of end organ damage, CRAB, which is familiar to you, C for calcium, R for renal insufficiency, A for anemia, and B for bone lesions. This is a photograph of Jan Waldenstrom and myself a quarter century ago. And he was not convinced by the 241 patients who were reported, and we weren't positive either. And so, and because these patients, these 241, had been collected from all over the United States, including several from Europe. And so we then looked at the patients in the 11 counties of southeastern Minnesota, 1,384, 54% males. The median age was 72 years, and fewer than 2% were less than 40 years of age. The median size of the M spike in this cohort was 12 grams per liter. Looking at the size of the M protein, you will find that more than a third of the patients had an M spike less than 10 grams per liter, and actually only 6% of the patients had an M spike that was greater than 20 grams per liter. These patients have just recently been followed up for a total of 14,547 years, a range as long as 43 years. Median duration was 8 years, and the data is quite mature in that 93% of the patients have died. When we look at this group of patients, we find that 97, or 2/3 of the group, went on to develop multiple myeloma. And looking at the Iowa SEER registry, and Iowa is the adjacent state to Minnesota, and the population is very much the same in both, that the expected number of patients with myeloma was 4.1, whereas the relative risk was increased 23.9-fold. Lymphoma was found in 19 patients, and in the last follow-up covering the last 15 years, no new patients with lymphoma developed. AL amyloidosis now has 14 patients with a relative risk of 8.8-fold based upon the Olmsted County incidence of AL amyloidosis. Macroglobulinemia, relative risk increased 47-fold when compared to the Iowa SEER data, and CLL, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, relative risk actually less than 1, and there is just one case of solitary plasmacytoma. This is the risk of progression of the total group. 10% at 10 years, 16% or 18% at 20 years, 28% at 30 years, and 37% at 4 years. Now, remember, this curve of approximately 1% per year includes not only myeloma, but also amyloidosis, Waldenstrom's, and the like. And when we look at the progression of the 97 patients with multiple myeloma, 2/3 of the total, we find that at 10 years, it was 6%, 12% at 20 years. At 30 years, it was 21%, and at 40 years, it was 27%. Just overall, a little more than 0.5% develop myeloma. This is the risk of progression to smoldering myeloma, and there were 83 patients who were identified as such, but I suspect that a very, very high percentage of all of the patients with multiple myeloma would have had a smoldering stage, but they were missed because of inadequate follow-up in those patients. The patterns of increase of the M protein was quite variable, as you can see here. There were 36 with a stable M protein, and then a sudden increase, a group with stable, and then a gradual increase. A group of patients with a gradual increase in the M protein until they became symptomatic. 12 patients who had a sudden increase in the M spike, and as you might imagine, there were a number of patients in whom it was indeterminate because we did not have serum protein electrophoresis on a regular basis in these patients. It's very important when talking to patients to emphasize the fact that that the M protein and plasma cell disorders that develop are relatively small compared to other things that the patient can develop. Other things being other malignancies, cardiovascular disease, and strokes. Keep in mind that the median age of these patients is 72 years of age, so they're at risk for a lot of things other than a plasma cell disorder. And I always emphasize that point in visiting with the patient because one does not want to unnecessarily alarm the patient. This shows the expected survival in yellow in a age and gender matched residents in the state of Minnesota, a little over 12 years compared to patients with an MGUS, which is a little over 4 years. Now, speaking of risk factors, as you know, the higher the M protein, the greater the risk of developing myeloma or another plasma cell disorder. And I want to emphasize the fact that those patients who have even a small M protein are also at significant risk over a period of time. When my colleague Vincent Rajkumar looked at this cohort of the 1,384 patients, he looked at various risk factors. That is, an M protein of less than 15 grams per liter, IgG instead of IgA or IgM, and a normal free light chain. These patients in the low-risk group had an absolute risk of progression at 20 years of 5%, and if one takes into account the cerebrovascular, cardiac, and the like, the risk for these low-risk patients is very low at 20 years, only 2%. On the other hand, if one looks at patients who have all three risk factors abnormal, one finds that the risk of progression absolute is 58% and 27% when one takes the competing risk approach. Here, with multivariate analysis, we found that the size of the M protein was important. The presence of IgG versus A or M was also important, and the free light chain ratio at the time of recognition of the MGUS was an important factor for prognosis. We also found that the reduction of uninvolved immunoglobulins did not reach statistical significance. We also looked at the presence of a recognized monoclonal light chain in the urine, and that too did not reach statistical significance. And we concluded that patients with MGUS are much more likely to die of unrelated disease than to progress, that multiple myeloma accounts for about 2/3 of the patients who progress to symptomatic disease. The overall risk of progression to any of these diseases is 1% per year. The risk of progression is associated with the size and the type of the M protein, as well as the free light chain ratio. And this is a listing of our clinical dysproteinemia group. The names of most of these people are very familiar to you. I will not recount them. And this is our epidemiology and biostatistics group, without whose help and guidance, I might add, allowed us to do the prospective studies of patients with MGUS. And with that, I thank you for your attention.